Without the Federal Reserve, the government couldn't borrow at this magnitude. The marketplace wouldn't support IT, but with the reserve as a guaranteed purchaser, there's nitrogen monoxide ceiling. The financial cage became boundless. By the 1970s, the financial cage Patterson, Rothschild, and Morgan constructed was operating globally. Every developed nation borrowed, extended obligations, serviced interest. But developing nations were different. They borrowed for construction, and many couldn't maintain distributions. The financial cage was reaching its boundaries, until Paul Volcker made it perpetual. Volcker was Federal Reserve chairman from 1979 to 1987, and he confronted a challenge. Inflation exceeded 10%. United States credibility was diminishing. Foreign governments were losing confidence in the dollar. He needed to halt inflation, even if it meant causing a recession. So in 1979, Volcker raised interest charges dramatically. The federal funds charge went from 11% to 20%, the highest in American recorded history. This crushed inflation. But IT had another consequence. Developing nations had borrowed billions in dollars throughout the 1970s. When charges were minimal, now those advances were due, and the interest charges had tripled. Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil $60 billion, Argentina $40 billion, and they couldn't satisfy. The interest alone exceeded their export revenues. In August 1982, Mexico announced it couldn't make distributions. Default. This should have initiated global financial demolition. American institutions had advanced most of that capital. If Mexico defaulted, Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, all would absorb massive losses. Some might collapse. The entire banking framework was at risk. Volcker had permitted IT to occur. Let the institutions absorb losses. Let the marketplace clear. But he didn't. Rather, he arranged a rescue through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF would advance Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and others sufficient capital to continue making interest distributions to American institutions. The advances were termed structural adjustment advances, and they arrived with stipulations. The stipulations were harsh. Governments had to reduce expenditure, privatize state assets, open marketplaces to foreign participation, devalue currencies. Essentially, dismantle their economic independence in exchange for the capital to continue servicing interest. And here's the key. The IMF advances didn't reduce obligations, they merely extended them, made them manageable, but perpetual. This is the Volcker innovation. When obligations become unsatisfiable, don't forgive them, restructure them. Advance sufficient capital to maintain interest distributions, flowing, and extract political and economic concessions in exchange. The financial cage became a tool of dominance. Nations that couldn't satisfy were compelled to open their economies, transfer their assets, and submit to foreign economic policy in exchange for the privilege of remaining in obligations. This pattern has repeated for 40 years. Greece in 2010, Argentina in 2001, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every instance, the same architecture. IMF advances to maintain servicing interest. Austerity imposed. Independence surrendered. And the obligations never eliminated, just restructured, made perpetual. Volcker passed away in 2019, but his legacy is the mechanism that ensures the financial cage is global and inescapable. Even when nations can't satisfy, they're not permitted to default. They're refinanced into perpetual indebtedness, and the interest continues flowing to the creditors. The same institutions, the same entities, the same framework Patterson established in 1694. Now let me demonstrate how these four architects constructed a framework where obligations are boundless and escape is unthinkable. Start with Patterson's framework. Government borrows. Services. Interest indefinitely. Never returns principal. Add Rothschild's innovation. Make the obligations tradable globally, so it's not one creditor. IT is a network. Default demolishes the framework. Add Morgan's mechanism. Central institutions. Manufacture currency to purchase government securities. Unlimited appetite. Government can always borrow more. Add Volcker's cage. When nations can't satisfy, restructure. Don't forgive. Maintain the interest flowing. The outcome is what we possess today. 315 trillion in global obligations. Government obligations. Corporate obligations. Household obligations. None of IT will ever be returned. All of IT services interest, and all of IT is connected through the financial framework. So default anywhere threatens demolition everywhere. Here's the specific mechanism. The United States government distributes $38 trillion in obligations. Who possesses IT? About $20 trillion is possessed by the American public. Retirement funds, mutual funds, insurance, enterprises, institutions, the Federal Reserve. These entities purchase Treasury securities because they're considered safe instruments, but those securities service interest, about $1 trillion per year now. That interest originates from taxation. So taxpayers transmit capital to the government transmits IT to security holders. The security holders are mostly entities possessed by the affluent. IT is a transfer from workers to capital every year, indefinitely. The other $18 trillion is owed to the government itself. Social Security Trust Fund, Medicare Trust Fund. The government borrowed from these programs and expended the capital. Now IT owes itself, but ultimately, taxpayers owe. Because when Social Security needs to redeem those securities, the government has to raise taxation or borrow more to satisfy. It's a deception, but the interest flows regardless. Now scale IT globally. Japan owes $9 trillion, mostly to Japanese entities and the Bank of Japan. Europe owes $14 trillion, mostly to European institutions and the ECB. China owes significant domestic obligations held by state institutions. Every nation is operating the same framework, and they're all interconnected. Japan holds United States treasuries. The United States holds European securities through the IMF. Europe holds developing nation obligations through the World Bank. It's circular. Everyone owes everyone, and the interest flows upward to the entities that administer the obligations. Here's why this can never conclude. If the United States satisfied its $38 trillion, the currency supply would demolish, because dollars are manufactured when the government borrows. If IT satisfied the obligations, those dollars would vanish. Deflation, depression, economic demolition, so the government can never satisfy IT. IT has to continue borrowing, continue extending IT, and continue servicing interest. The same is true globally. If every government satisfied its obligations, the global currency supply would contract by TWO3. There wouldn't be sufficient currency to conduct exchange. The framework would freeze, so obligations can't be eliminated. IT's structural, essential, by engineering, and here's who profits. The entities that hold the obligations: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. These asset administrators control tens of trillions. They purchase government securities with other people's capital, retirement funds, retirement accounts, insurance premiums, and they collect the interest, about $1 trillion per year from United States obligations alone, plus interest from Japan, Europe, everywhere. That trillion per year in interest distributions flows from taxpayers to security holders. It's the largest prosperity transfer in recorded history. Continuous, structural, and invisible to most people. Because it's not termed a levy. IT's termed obligation service, but it's the same mechanism. Workers satisfy, entities collect, and the obligations never decrease. Now, here's the final element. The four architects didn't conspire together. They lived in different centuries, but they each resolved a challenge in a way that benefited financiers, and each resolution built on the previous one. Patterson made obligations perpetual. In 1694, Rothschild made them global in 1815, Morgan made them boundless in 1913, Volcker made them inescapable in 1982. Together, they constructed a framework where governments borrow indefinitely and service interest eternally. And the people who control the securities, who administer the obligations, who collect the interest, they're the ultimate beneficiaries. Not governments. Not taxpayers. The financial entities. And here's the final truth. $38 trillion isn't a crisis for them. It's a revenue model. Every dollar of obligations is an asset on someone's ledger. IT services interest. IT provides security for more borrowing. And as long as confidence maintains, as long as people believe the government will service interest even if IT never returns principal, the framework operates. The financial cage is complete. Escape is impossible. Not without demolishing the entire financial framework. 4 architects, 3 centuries, 1 framework, and everyone on Earth is now ensnared inside IT. If this transformed how you perceive government obligations, if you finally comprehend that $38 trillion is not an accident or error, but a framework operating precisely as engineered, Then you're starting to perceive how authority actually operates. Subscribe if you want to comprehend how the apparatus was constructed and who's operating IT. Because they're not going to teach you this in educational institutions. They're going to teach you that obligations are a challenge to resolve. But the architects recognized better. Obligations aren't a challenge, they're the foundation. And interest is the rent we satisfy to exist in their framework. Look at the numbers. Global debt sits at $315 trillion. That's 3 times what the entire world produces in a year. Now here's what should keep you awake at night. When everybody's in debt, where's the money actually going? Follow that thread far enough and you'll find something remarkable. The planet isn't indebted to some external force. We are indebted to ourselves. 4 financial innovators spanning 300 years made certain of that. Intentionally, they constructed a framework where repayment becomes impossible, where nations borrow in perpetuity, where interest payments never cease, and where those who engineered this mechanism extract value from every transaction, every emergency, every rescue package. This isn't hidden knowledge, these are documented facts. The gatherings took place. The agreements were signed. The structures are publicly available. Once you understand their construction, you'll realize why that 38 trillion figure isn't a challenge awaiting resolution. It's the apparatus functioning precisely as intended. Let me introduce you to the 4 builders, the 4 pivotal moments when this financial cage was constructed, and why every nation now finds itself trapped with nitrogen monoxide exit strategy. Prior to 1694, monarchs financed their needs through traditional channels. They'd approach wealthy merchants or nobility, guarantee returns with interest. When payment proved impossible, they'd simply fail to pay. Lenders absorbed losses. Monarchs found new sources. IT carried risk for creditors and humiliation for rulers. But the damage stayed localized. Obligations were finite, either fulfilled or abandoned. The ledger eventually balanced. William Paterson revolutionized everything. A Scottish trader and financial architect who'd experienced numerous failed ventures. In 1691, he conceived something that would transform human civilization. England was engaged in conflict with France. King William III desperately required funding. The treasury stood empty. Tax collection couldn't match military expenditure, and conventional lenders were declining additional credit because England had previously defaulted. Paterson presented the monarch with an offer. He would assemble a consortium of prosperous traders to provide the government with £1.2 million. That translates to roughly $300 million in contemporary value. An enormous figure, but here's the breakthrough. The advance would remain outstanding indefinitely. Rather than principal repayment, the government would service interest continuously, 8% each year. And to administer this structure, Paterson suggested establishing a novel entity. The Bank of England. The framework was groundbreaking. The merchant creditors would transfer their gold to the Bank of England. The institution would advance it to the government. The government would distribute interest yearly from tax collections, and the institution would channel that interest to the merchant creditors. But here's the crucial element. The government wouldn't return the original sum. Never. The advance was everlasting. Why would traders embrace this? Because the interest distribution was secured by Parliament. IT was supported by the government's taxation authority. As long as England could collect from its citizens, the interest would continue, and the certificates the creditors received for their gold could be exchanged. They functioned as currency, superior to currency, because they generated returns. Parliament endorsed Paterson's framework in 1694. The Bank of England received its charter. The traders supplied their gold. The government secured its military financing. And for the first time in recorded history, sovereign obligations became perpetual. Not a challenge, requiring solutions, an integral system feature. And here's what standard explanations omit about why this brilliantly served the financiers. The government distributed 8% interest yearly on £1.2 million. That's £96,000 annually, indefinitely. The traders had effectively purchased a continuous payment stream from the government. As long as England persisted, as long as taxation continued, the funds flowed. And if they desired their gold returned, they could transfer the certificates to another party. The obligation was movable, but never erasable. But Paterson's true brilliance emerged subsequently. The Bank of England received authority. to generate certificates backed by the government's obligation. They could produce paper currency, equivalent to the advance value. This manufactured money from obligations, the government's promise, became legal tender, and greater government borrowing enabled more money creation. This established the model: government borrows, never, returns principal, services interest eternally, and the obligation itself transforms into currency. It's magnificent if you're a financier, devastating if you're a taxpayer, because you're servicing interest on obligations that will never vanish. Within 5 decades, every significant European authority replicated the framework. France established the Banque Generale. The Netherlands already possessed advanced banking but standardized government obligation distribution. And by 1790, the recently formed United States embraced the identical framework. Alexander Hamilton, whom we've discussed previously, explicitly patterned America's financial architecture on the Bank of England. Perpetual obligations, interest drawn from taxation, securities exchanged as currency. Patterson passed away in 1719 without substantial wealth, despite founding the Bank of England. But his creation endures 331 years forward. The Bank of England continues operating. British government obligations have never been settled. They've been renegotiated, extended, and enlarged, but never eliminated. The financial cage was established in 1694, and every government subsequently has entered it voluntarily. By the early 19th century, European governments had welcomed indebtedness. They borrowed for conflicts, for construction, for operational costs. But nitrogen monoxide organized marketplace existed. Each advance was arranged separately. Interest charges fluctuated dramatically, and only the most prosperous traders could engage. Nathan Rothschild transformed that. He industrialized sovereign obligations. The Rothschild dynasty originated as currency exchangers and merchants in Frankfurt. By 1800, the 5 Rothschild siblings had created banking establishments in 5 major European centers: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples. This network was unmatched. They could transfer capital across frontiers faster than any competitor, and they leveraged this to control sovereign obligation distribution. Nathan Rothschild in London was the strategic mastermind. Throughout the Napoleonic conflicts, Nathan facilitated advances for Britain. But his innovation was structural. Rather than advancing directly to the government, he purchased government securities at reduced rates and resold them to participants at higher rates. He established a secondary marketplace. Government required capital. Rothschild supplied it immediately. Then he transferred the securities to retirement funds, insurance enterprises, and affluent individuals. The government received its capital quickly. Rothschild captured the differential, and participants received a tradable instrument. But here's where it becomes sinister. Rothschild didn't merely finance governments, he positioned himself so governments had nitrogen monoxide alternative but to engage him. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild famously received intelligence of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. His messenger network exceeded official channels. He exploited this intelligence to manipulate the security marketplace. Initially, he disposed of British securities, indicating that Britain was failing. Values plummeted. Other participants panicked and disposed. Then, after values crashed, Rothschild acquired massive quantities at minimal values. When intelligence of British triumph arrived the following day, security values surged. Rothschild generated millions, not from what we'd term insider knowledge today, but from controlling intelligence and marketplace timing. This established the Rothschild framework. Control the intelligence, control the distribution, control the marketplace. By 1820, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign obligations. If a government needed to borrow, they engaged the Rothschilds. Because the Rothschilds controlled the participant network, they possessed the distribution, and they established the conditions. Here's why this matters for the financial cage. Before Rothschild, governments could theoretically refuse payment. If a monarch defaulted, his creditors absorbed losses and the framework reset, but Rothschild made sovereign obligations tradable across frontiers. A British security might be possessed by a French participant who transferred it to a German institution who leveraged it as security for an advance to an Austrian noble. The network of possession became so intricate that defaulting wasn't merely refusing one creditor. It was demolishing an entire international financial network. This is the Rothschild innovation. Make obligations so interconnected that default becomes unthinkable. Not because Governments are honorable because default would initiate systemic demolition. Governments became ensnared, they had to continue paying, and they had to continue borrowing to service the interest on previous obligations. The financial cage was nitrogen monoxide, longer merely perpetual. IT was inescapable. The Rothschild dynasty wealth crested in the mid-19th century. They were the most prosperous dynasty globally, more prosperous than any monarch, and that prosperity originated from one source: interest on sovereign obligations. They didn't manufacture anything, didn't construct anything. They advanced capital to governments and collected interest indefinitely. The framework Patterson established. In 1694, Rothschild industrialized by 1815, and every government in Europe was ensnared. BY 1900, America was emerging as an economic giant, but it maintained a rudimentary financial framework. Institutions operated independently. Currency supply, WAS connected to gold, and there was nitrogen monoxide central mechanism to administer obligations. J.P. Morgan corrected that, not for public welfare to safeguard his banking empire, in 1907. There was a financial emergency. Stock valuations crashed, institutions failed, and the economy froze. J.P. Morgan personally arranged a rescue. He assembled the major New York financiers in his library, secured the doors, and compelled them to commit their own capital to stabilize failing institutions. IT succeeded. The emergency concluded. Morgan became the unofficial central financier of America, but he was 70 years old. He recognized he couldn't repeat IT. So Morgan and his collaborators, the most powerful financiers in America, engineered a permanent resolution. They required a central institution, but Americans despise central institutions. The first and second institutions of the United States had been terminated by populist resistance, so Morgan's circle disguised IT in 1910. Morgan's collaborators, including Senator Nelson Aldrich and representatives from the largest institutions, conducted a confidential gathering on Jekyll Island, Georgia. For 9 days, they engineered the architecture of what would become the Federal Reserve System. The gatherings were confidential because they recognized if the public discovered that financiers were engineering the nation's monetary framework, there would be upheaval. The strategy was brilliant political manipulation. The Federal Reserve wouldn't be termed a central institution. IT would be termed a Federal Reserve System. IT wouldn't be one entity. IT would be 12 regional institutions. IT wouldn't be controlled by Wall Street. IT would be supervised by a board of governors selected by the president. IT appeared decentralized, democratic, public. But the architecture ensured financier control. The regional Federal Reserve institutions were privately possessed by member institutions. Those institutions elected the boards of the regional reserves, and the regional reserves elected the Federal Reserve Board. The government selected some members, but the financiers controlled the framework. And the most significant authority, the authority to manufacture currency and purchase government securities, was granted to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which was controlled by the largest Wall Street institutions. Morgan's institutions. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913, largely because most representatives didn't comprehend what they were endorsing, and immediately the financial cage expanded. Now the government didn't merely borrow from institutions. It borrowed from the Federal Reserve, which could manufacture currency to purchase securities. Unlimited appetite for government obligations. Here's why this matters. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a ceiling to how much the government could borrow. Institutions only possessed finite capital to advance, but the Federal Reserve could manufacture currency by purchasing government securities. The government distributes a security. The reserve purchases it with newly manufactured currency. The government expends the currency, and the obligation goes on the reserve's ledger, supported by nothing but the guarantee that taxpayers will service IT indefinitely. This is the mechanism that enables boundless obligations. The Federal Reserve ensures there's always a purchaser for government securities, always appetite, so the government never has to cease borrowing. IT can extend obligations indefinitely because the reserve will always purchase them, and the interest distributions flow from taxpayers to the institutions that possess the Federal Reserve framework. Morgan passed away in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was established. But his legacy is the architecture that makes the current $38 trillion in United States obligations possible.